As I turned to leave the barn, I heard a desperate groan and the thud that 1,000 pounds of cow makes as it hits a dirt floor. Bessie was gone, and my family was now in danger. If I had told you the simple fact of the matter, my cow died, would you be as engaged? Why were those first sentences so much more interesting? Because it was the beginning of a story, and human beings are storytellers. Our brains are hardwired for story. Storytelling helps our brains make sense of complex information. We connect to the information emotionally so that it becomes meaningful and therefore worth remembering. Jonathan Gottschall wrote all about the science behind storytelling in a fascinating book I'm sure you would enjoy much more than this simple module. But he doesn't really tell you how to tell a story. So I'm going to try to do that today. I should start by saying that I am Jim Kelly, Associate Professor and Director of the Journalism Program at Indiana University, Bloomington. This Laser Pulse learning module on effective storytelling and research translation is based on my 20 years of teaching in East Africa as a U.S. Department of State trainer and more recently as a visiting scholar at Moi University in Kenya. I've learned a lot about storytelling from my Kenyan colleagues in journalism, and I want to share them with you. I hope my experience provides you with helpful insight into how valuable storytelling can be when trying to explain scientific research to a non-scientific audience. The problem to be addressed today is that you may not think scientists are storytellers. Scientists let objective facts speak. They need nothing more. But you actually are a storyteller. You tell a story every time you write a journal article or present a conference paper. Your audience are experts in your field. Your language is highly technical and includes jargon. Your story structure is standardized according to how you were trained as an academic, quite possibly intro, lit review, method, findings, discussion, and conclusion. That's you telling a story. In this lesson, I hope you will learn how to adjust your storytelling methods so the story appeals to an audience that is not expert, but is nevertheless important. You will learn how to adjust your structure to one that is more familiar to the audience and adjust your language to a vocabulary that is also more familiar. As I talk to you about storytelling, I am also telling you a story that started with a cow and now includes my friend Kenneth. Storytelling is a time-honored tradition for influencing others that appeals to everyone on a basic human level. Rather than describing how you arrived at your findings, tell a story about how the problem presented itself and how what you learned can change things for the better. This is useful because as you engage in your research translation projects, your findings will engage and inform non-technical experts in ways they understand. Consider the effects storytelling can have when you're engaging with stakeholders, designing content for research translation products, and conducting dissemination activities. Enhancing your storytelling skills can improve the relevance and applicability of these activities, leading to greater development impact from your research. I have 3 objectives. Explain what storytelling is, describe the component parts of a story, and introduce an organizing principle that allows you to connect the concrete to the abstract in your storytelling. Storytelling is the process of using fact and narrative to communicate something to your audience. More specifically, storytelling is a means for sharing and interpreting experiences. It's not simply you talking, it is also the audience listening. Stories can be fully factual, like a news report, or entirely fictional, like a myth, fairy tale, or legend. My assumption about my audience today is that you scientists want to inform your audience about facts and relationships you have discovered in your research. Therefore, I will limit the scope of my lesson to a nonfiction approach where any embellishment is obvious and closely related to the research-based facts. Telling stories gives us a sense of culture, history, and personal identity. As a member of your audience, I may not be able to relate well to the scientific method or grand theory. I can, however, appreciate our shared culture, history, and humanity. Focus on those connections and minimize the distinctions between you and the audience. Be more than just the distinguished expert. Be the visitor with a really good story. You can play this storyteller role when presenting findings, but a good story is welcome in many contexts, including meetings, side conversations at events, and in materials you develop as a research translation product. When you present at a conference of peers, you explain your research based on the shared experiences of research scientists. When you present to a lay audience, the story you tell must exploit the shared experiences you have with the non-experts. Storytelling transforms findings into insights, transforms discussion into discoveries, and transforms conclusions into possibilities. Storytelling changes participants into families, neighborhoods, communities, and even nations. Storytelling turns the abstract theory into concrete plans and, somewhat paradoxically, turns the concrete and pragmatic into abstractions like success and well-being. I want to build on this idea by first giving you some insight into story structure, listing a few very practical tips and insights, and then presenting a theoretical model that hopefully helps you see the relation between the abstract and the concrete in your story. A good storyteller will typically identify their two most salient points and bookend their story with them. They will open with an exciting anecdote to grab the audience's attention, and then they will make sure the last thing they say is something that can resonate with the audience long after the story is over. That something is often something alluded to in the initial anecdote, just as I did when I spoke of my dead cow. In other words, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every story has these three parts. Transforming research into a story is almost always going to take a linear narrative form, beginning, middle, and end. Your research journal articles do that, and given the empirical basis of the information you wish to impart to your non-expert audience, your story will probably most accurately be told and understood using a straight-line narrative that starts at the beginning and relates consecutive events until the ending conclusion. This does not mean you cannot leave the straight-line narrative for elaborate description, explanation, or even analysis, but straying too far from the main narrative can cause your audience to lose track of the basic story that you're trying to tell. You remember my dead cow intro, right? That was the hook. My slides have minimal text and lots of photos. And honestly, I am trying to be concise. My main point is storytelling. Photos are inherently emotive. Use photographs of people as much as you possibly can. Which brings me to one of my favorites, show rather than tell. You've noticed my photos, right? Use lots of photos of people because we learn so much more. From the photos I have shown already, you know that there were about 40 people of modest means in the crowd, and that there were more women there than men, and that they were taking notes and listening intently. That's a lot of words just now that I didn't really need to say because you've already learned that and much more by quickly looking at the photos. The words I put on the screen were important, but most of the information has been delivered by the photos. If you don't have photos of your own and you cannot locate suitable images from an available collection at your organization, consider adjusting your language to show the audience something in their mind's eye rather than telling them simple facts. Recall that opening I started my story with? The language I used conjured up an image. The image you see right now might have been replaced with language like, dozens of farmers sat in plastic chairs wearing bright homemade African print clothing, listening intently to the experts talk as they wrote notes on small bits of paper in their laps. Do not rush. You can, however, show one thing while you are saying another thing. As we wait a moment, so I don't appear to be rushing, notice how small her piece of paper is. You don't have to be a comedian, but if you are going to poke fun at yourself and nobody else. My wife hates this shirt. I only wear it in Africa. I don't think the Africans like it much either. Allow and welcome interruption. Because just as the presentation was hitting its stride, it started to rain. Everybody moved into a nearby church to continue, but it was a welcome interruption to the drought we'd been experiencing. These are the components to most every story. The one I've been telling about, the Kenya Silage Workshop, has so far included setting, characters, and a bit of plot. The workshop's purpose was to get people to accept silage farming as a solution to the problem of drought. Here, the leader of the Kaptewet Olge Dairy Co-op agreed with the visiting scientists, but said the problem was that the calculations required for silage feeding were too complicated. The local agricultural officer, who'd been in attendance since the beginning, pledged to help the farmers with the formula and other technical concerns. That's a reiteration of the problem, sometimes also known as the conflict, but it was also the start of the resolution. In my little story here, the resolution is the end of the workshop and the agreement to keep in touch via text messaging. While each of my photos represents a storytelling component, there are two that are harder to see, but nevertheless present. They are theme and structure. I hope you can see that the theme is conveyance of scientific information to farmers at a workshop, and that the structure is a simple beginning, middle, and end. Not all stories have a conflict or a complex structure like the narrative arc that you may have heard about in literature class while in college. But they all have scene, characters, a plot, a problem or conflict, and a resolution or end, with a purposive theme and a structure. Please pause for a moment and identify the components that each of these photos might represent. You surely realize that some of these photos represent two or more components. For example, this photo of Kenneth is both a main character and secondary characters, as well as scene and even the start of the plot. To some extent, the richer the story element in terms of components, the more engaging the story overall. The structure is that in the beginning, experts hosted a workshop for farmers. Mustafa, the Pakistani expert, presented data about silage. Kenneth, the Kenyan expert, told a story about a poor farmer whose cow had died during a recent drought. A problem presented itself just as the much-needed rain began to fall. The farm co-op leader said there was too much complexity given the amount of risk involved. Kenneth told a story about a different farmer who used silage to feed his animals during a subsequent drought and paid her children's school fees with the milk profits. People discussed among themselves what they had learned and how they will act together and in concert with the local expert. The resolution is that the people leave with new, very concrete, research-based facts about silage and a story about how they each might achieve prosperity. You will note that the action being described is concrete, but that the theme is abstract. A good story allows the reader to connect ideas in two directions, from the concrete to the abstract, and from the abstract to the concrete. This is nicely facilitated by the ladder of abstraction, a theoretical model developed by the American linguist S.I. Hayakawa in his 1949 book, Language in Thought and Action. The latter is generally helpful in revealing how stories can be understood at different levels because different levels of abstraction are built into the narrative. I'll explain it very briefly here, but for a more extensive and surely a much better lesson, I've included a URL to a web page on the final page of this slide deck. The latter may be especially useful for scientists because you generally think in abstraction and conceptualization, but you often must convey concepts and findings in concrete terms to audiences far less familiar with the theories you work within. Rather than a story structure, the latter helps the author identify story concepts and order them on the ladder. As you ask questions about your story, the why-style questions increase in significance as we go up the ladder towards abstraction, while the how-style questions increase in significance as we move down the ladder toward concrete. In my story, I was wondering why busy people might spend time going to a workshop with a couple of scientists who had no ties to the community. At the most abstract level, it would be to achieve prosperity. At the most concrete level, it would be to learn how to avoid another dead cow. Between these two extremes, I list things that figure into the story, some rather abstract, like a school fee, some pretty concrete, like a workshop. Between those is the stuff of scientific research. This is where the workshop experts would be discussing the data that silage farming is based upon and how various formulas, techniques, and methods are used to conduct silage farming in an African village. Your audience might be government officials, a foundation board, or an NGO administrative team. Doesn't matter. Storytelling works the same. Although you must develop the theme and construct the structure with a specific audience in mind. Farmers and government bureaucrats are all human beings and lovers of stories, but they relate to different types of story components depending on their experience and professional responsibilities. In every story you tell, just order your thoughts along the ladder of abstraction and then build the elements you need for a good story told to a specific audience. Why not pause the video for a moment and fill in the rungs on a ladder of your own based on one of your recent research articles that you would like to explain to a non-scientist cousin? Find a PDF form called Ladder of Abstraction Form. It is a worksheet that will guide you through the creation of your own ladder. You may find it helpful to fill in the top rung first, then the bottom rung, and then the rungs in between. Feel free to move items from rung to rung until you have a hierarchy you think makes sense to you and will make sense to your audience. Thanks for listening to my little story about storytelling. I hope you now have a better idea of what storytelling is, can identify the component parts of a story you might tell about your research, and understand how the ladder of abstraction can help you move between abstract thinking and concrete examples for your audience. We hope you can take these skills and apply storytelling techniques to presentations, webinars, policy briefs, or even one-on-one conversations with those who can help you reach impact. We will wrap up this module with a 2-minute evaluation. Should you care to explore storytelling further, the final slide has links of some materials that you might enjoy and benefit from. This is that final slide, a list of resources that will, I hope, further inspire your storytelling. Good luck and enjoy.